"Sign the papers, Dad. It is for your own good," my son Julian said, his voice carrying that cold, practiced efficiency he had learned from his corporate ladder-climbing wife, Victoria. I looked down at the document spread across my handmade oak kitchen table. There lay the power of attorney, the listing agreement for the home I had built with my own 2 hands, and the brochure for a cheap, sterile care facility that smelled of bleach and forgotten lives. Victoria stood behind him, crossing her arms, her eyes scanning my living room like an appraiser looking at junk. They treated me like an obsolete relic, a worn-out gear in their fast-paced machine, completely unaware that a retired precision machinist knows exactly when he is being played. For 40 years, I worked with tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. I know how to spot a flaw, and right now, the flaw was in my own flesh and blood. Since my beloved Eleanor passed away 6 months ago, the house had become a quiet void, a temple of grief where the silence was deafening. But instead of offering comfort, Julian and Victoria saw my sorrow as a weakness, an opportunity to strip away my dignity and claim the family estate. They wanted me locked away in a cage of their choosing, all so they could fund their desperate facade of luxury. I swallowed my pride, keeping my face a mask of fragile exhaustion, hiding the sharp, calculating mind that had kept heavy machinery running for decades. Victoria leaned in, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that made my stomach turn. She told me that managing this property was too much for a grieving old man, that I was slipping, and that they only wanted to protect me. Julian would not even meet my eyes, staring instead at his expensive watch, a man who had traded his soul for a social climbing dream. I calmly slid the papers back across the table, telling them I needed a few days to think. The disappointment on Victoria's face was sharp, a momentary slip of her polite mask that revealed the predatory hunger underneath. They left with parting warnings about my health, leaving me alone in the heavy, aching silence. I walked down the hallway to Eleanor's bedroom, where the air still carried the faint, sweet scent of her lavender perfume. I sat on the edge of the bed, my rough, calloused hands trembling slightly as I opened her jewelry box. Resting on the velvet cushion was her favorite vintage mechanical watch, a beautiful piece of Swiss craftsmanship I had gifted her on our 10th anniversary. I picked it up, expecting to hear its familiar rhythmic heartbeat, but there was only silence. The watch had stopped ticking on the exact day she passed away, at the exact hour the doctors said her heart failed. As a machinist, I knew mechanical watches do not just die of broken hearts. They stop because of friction, tension, or a deliberate hand. Looking closely at the delicate hands frozen in time, a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Eleanor had been anxious and fearful in her final days, whispering warnings I had dismissed as delirium. I realized then that the watch held a deeper connection to her final hours. Tomorrow, I would take it to my trusted old friend, a master clockmaker, sensing that the truth was waiting to be wound back up. I have spent my entire life believing that numbers do not lie, that tolerances are absolute, and that a machine built with perfect balance will never betray its creator. But holding Eleanor's silent watch in my calloused palm, I knew that a far more sinister calculation had been set in motion. The weight of the steel felt cold, a heavy, quiet accusation against my own failure to protect her from the snakes in our own home. I refused to let my grief blind me any longer. I drove to the oldest corner of the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled resolve. Thomas's workshop was a sanctuary of mechanical order, a dusty, narrow room smelling of machine oil, aged oak, and the endless rhythmic heartbeat of 100 brass clocks ticking in unison. Thomas, a master horologist whose fingers were as steady as a surgeon's, looked up from his cluttered workbench. He did not ask about my sorrow. He simply looked at the vintage Swiss timepiece in my hand, recognizing the quiet desperation in my eyes. I told him it had stopped the exact moment her heart did, and that my instinct, honed by 40 years of precision machining, told me this was no natural mechanical failure. Thomas nodded slowly, sliding his magnifying loupe over his eye. He laid the watch on a clean green felt mat, lit his overhead lamp, and began the delicate autopsy of my wife's most cherished possession. I watched with analytical intensity as he removed the case back, exposing the intricate golden heartbeat of the Swiss movement. It was a masterpiece of gears, springs, and bridges, but it was frozen in time. Using ultra-fine tweezers, Thomas began to unscrew the balance bridge, his movements slow, deliberate, and tense. The silence in the room stretched thin, punctuated only by the metallic clicks of his tiny screwdrivers and the steady, indifferent ticking of the grandfather clocks around us. I kept my breathing shallow, tracking every microscopic movement, my mind cataloging the physical reality of the gears. As Thomas carefully lifted the escape wheel and peered beneath the mainspring gears, his hands suddenly froze. A sharp, audible gasp escaped his lips, his shoulders tensing under his worn leather apron. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and profound alarm. Hidden meticulously behind the delicate gearwork, where no ordinary person would ever think to look, was a tiny, waterproofed strip of parchment folded with microscopic precision. Thomas did not speak. He merely used his finest tweezers to extract the sliver of paper, laying it gently under his high-powered magnifying lens. He slid the heavy glass toward me, gesturing for me to look. I leaned forward, pressing the loupe to my eye, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the magnified glass, Eleanor's frantic, elegant handwriting leaped out at me, burned into my soul. "Arthur, they are changing my medicine," the note read. "Don't trust the paperwork. Look behind the cellar brick." The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. My wife had not slipped away quietly. She had been trapped, fighting a silent, desperate war against the very people we called family. Eleanor knew she was being systematically manipulated before her death, and she had used her last ounce of strength to leave me a blueprint for justice. The grief that had paralyzed me for months evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating rage. The ticking of the clocks around me no longer sounded like a countdown to my own demise. It was the steady countdown to my retribution. I did not drive home like a man in mourning. I drove with the cold, focused precision of a machine that had just been recalibrated. The tiny scrap of parchment from Eleanor's watch burned a hole in my pocket, its microscopic letters etched into my mind. My own daughter-in-law, Victoria, and my own son, Julian, had been feeding on my wife's vulnerability. The grief that had weighed down my limbs for 6 long months was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. They thought I was a fragile old fool, ready to be swept away into some cheap, sterile facility, but they forgot what 40 years of precision machining actually means. It means you do not panic when a system fails. You find the exact point of failure, and you disassemble the threat. I let myself into the quiet house, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like a crime scene. I bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the cellar door. The heavy rain was beating violently against the small, high basement windows, casting flickering, watery shadows across the concrete floor. But my hands remained steady. I turned on the single overhead bulb, its harsh yellow light illuminating the rows of my old metal lathes, calipers, and toolboxes. Eleanor's note had said to look behind the cellar brick. To anyone else, the cellar wall was a uniform barrier of clay and mortar, but to my trained eyes, every structure has a tolerance, a seam, a minute deviation. I began my sweep, running my calloused fingertips along the cold masonry. I knew this foundation. I had laid these bricks myself decades ago. I systematically checked the corners near the old coal chute, the areas least likely to be disturbed. It took me 20 minutes of patient, procedural searching before my thumb caught on a slight, imperceptible gap. The mortar around a single brick near the base of the chimney was dry, crumbling easily under pressure. I took a screwdriver, slid it into the seam, and applied just enough leverage. The brick slipped forward with a hollow, scraping sound, revealing a hidden cavity. Reaching into the dark, dusty opening, my fingers brushed against something wrapped in thick, oil-slicked canvas. I pulled it out, my heart hammering a steady, heavy rhythm. I carefully unwrapped the protective cloth on my workbench. Inside lay Eleanor's personal medical diary, its leather cover worn, alongside a small, heavy brass key to a private safe deposit box. My hands trembled as I opened the diary, her familiar, elegant handwriting filling the pages, detailing a nightmare I had been too blind to see. The entries started 8 months before her death. Eleanor had meticulously documented every visit from Victoria. As a senior administrator at the local clinic, Victoria had taken complete control of Eleanor's healthcare, adjusting her dosages under the guise of daughterly devotion. Eleanor wrote about sudden, terrifying brain fog, and how Victoria would calmly convince her she was losing her mind. Victoria was altering clinic records, swapping heart medication for heavy sedatives to make Eleanor appear mentally incompetent, creating a paper trail to seize our assets. Reading her desperate words, a cold, calculating rage settled over me. Victoria and Julian had engineered my wife's decline, but they left a trail, and now I held the key to their destruction. They did not even knock with the courtesy of guests. They rattled the doorknob first, a subtle assertion of ownership that made my blood run cold. I had barely slipped Eleanor's medical diary into the secret compartment of my workbench when the heavy front door swung open. Julian walked in first, his posture rigid with a forced, defensive confidence, followed closely by Victoria, whose eyes swept the room for signs of my mental decline. But it was the third man walking behind them who caught my attention. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase like a weapon. I quietly reached into my cardigan pocket and pressed the small button on my digital voice recorder, a tool I once used for logging machine tolerances, now repurposed to log their undoing. Victoria rushed toward me, her face contorted into a mask of exaggerated concern. She told me I looked incredibly frail, her voice pitched high as if speaking to a frightened child. She introduced the man beside her as Marcus, a friendly financial advisor who had offered to help organize my cluttered estate. I let my shoulders slump, allowing my hands to mimic the slight tremor of a weak, defeated old man. I looked at Marcus, catching the predatory gleam in his eyes and the brief, dismissive smirk he shared with Julian. My son would not look me in the eye, choosing instead to stare at the scuff marks on his expensive shoes. They thought they were dealing with a dying fire, unaware of the furnace burning deep inside me. Marcus did not waste time. He opened his briefcase with a sharp metallic snap and laid a thick stack of legal documents onto my oak table. He spoke with a rapid, hypnotic cadence, weaving complex financial jargon with warnings about probate court, tax penalties, and the heavy burden of managing a historic home. He pointed a manicured finger at the signature lines, explaining that these guardianship papers were merely a protective shield, claiming my recent forgetfulness proved I could no longer manage my estate. Victoria nodded eagerly, whispering that my grief had clouded my judgment to a dangerous degree. I watched her lips move, noting the tiny twitch in her left eyelid, a nervous tic she always got when she was lying. I played my part flawlessly, letting a look of confused panic wash over my face. I asked them if I was truly doing that poorly, my voice cracking slightly to mimic a man losing his grip on reality. Julian finally spoke, his voice trembling as he told me it was for my own good, urging me to just sign the papers so we could all move forward. I saw the desperate hunger in Victoria's eyes, her fingers twitching as she slid a heavy gold pen toward me. They wanted my house, my savings, and my silence. But my mind was sharper than ever, recording every manipulative phrase, every false promise, and every legal threat they uttered. I told them my hand was too unsteady to sign today, promising to review the documents tonight. The collective sigh of frustration from the three wolves was music to my ears, but they left the papers, believing they had already won. As the door closed, I pulled the recorder from my pocket, a cold smile touching my lips. The heavy brass key in my pocket felt like a loaded weapon, cold and unyielding against my thigh, as I walked into the marble lobby of the First National Bank. I did not look like a man about to uncover a conspiracy. I looked like a quiet, grieving widower, moving with slow, deliberate steps. But beneath my worn woolen coat, my heart beat with the steady, unshakable rhythm of a machine that had just been recalibrated for a single, final task. For 40 years, I had worked with tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch, knowing that even the smallest misalignment would eventually tear a machine apart. Now, I was about to find the final, fatal flaw in my son's elaborate trap. The bank manager led me down into the basement, where the air grew cool and smelled of old paper and heavy steel. We stopped before the massive vault door, a masterpiece of precision engineering that filled me with a strange sense of comfort. The manager turned his key, and I turned Eleanor's brass key, the synchronized mechanism clicking open with a heavy, satisfying thud. The safety deposit box slid out of its sleeve with a metallic scrape that echoed off the cold marble walls. I carried the long steel container into a small, private viewing room, closing the door behind me to lock out the rest of the world. When I lifted the lid, the sheer weight of Eleanor's foresight took my breath away. At the very top of the stack lay her original, uncorrupted last will and testament. It was a pristine document, drafted by an independent attorney, leaving the entirety of our estate solely to me, specifically warning of any unauthorized claims by Julian or Victoria. Beneath the will lay a thick stack of bank statements. My analytical mind quickly dissected the columns, tracking a series of massive, unauthorized transfers initiated over the last year of Eleanor's life. Julian's forged signature was on every single document, a desperate paper trail of greed. But it was the final document, sealed in a plain manila envelope, that turned my blood to absolute ice. It was a forensic toxicology report, privately commissioned by Eleanor from an independent laboratory just weeks before she died. The results were stark and terrifying. High, toxic levels of prescription sedatives were present in her blood, the very drugs Victoria had been administering under the guise of medical care. Eleanor had known what they were doing to her, and she had meticulously gathered the proof, trusting me to find it when the time was right. The grief that had weighed me down for months vanished, replaced by an icy, absolute resolve. I carefully packed the documents into my briefcase and drove straight to the office of Vance, a retired federal prosecutor and a trusted friend from my youth. Vance sat in his leather chair, his sharp eyes scanning the toxicology report and the forged bank transfers. A slow, grim smile spread across his face as he looked up at me. "Arthur," he said quietly, "this isn't just a defense. This is a total legal execution. They have walked right into a steel trap of their own making. Together, we spent the next 3 hours mapping out the counterstrike, ensuring every legal loophole was welded shut. The trap was set, and the countdown had officially begun. I sat at the head of my handmade oak kitchen table, staring at the heavy gold pen Victoria had slid toward me, feeling the absolute weight of their betrayal pressing down on this room. My son Julian stood near the window, checking his expensive watch yet again, while Victoria hovered over my shoulder like a bird of prey, waiting for its meal. Beside them sat Marcus, their corrupt lawyer, his manicured hands resting on his leather briefcase, his face wearing the smug grin of a man who believed he had successfully cornered a defenseless animal. They thought this was the final act of my surrender, the moment they would strip away my home, my dignity, and my late wife Eleanor's legacy under the guise of their hollow guardianship. I picked up the pen, letting my hand tremble just enough to keep their confidence high, and looked up at Victoria. I asked her if she was truly certain that this was the only way to protect me, giving her one last chance to show a single shred of humanity. She leaned in, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickening sweetness as she lied to my face, telling me that my mind was failing and that she only wanted what was best for Eleanor's memory. That was the exact moment I stopped playing the victim. I set the heavy gold pen down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and let the fragile, exhausted facade slide completely off my face. I looked Marcus directly in the eye, watching his smug smile falter as my voice shifted from a trembling whisper to the cold, authoritative steel of a man who had spent 40 years commanding heavy machinery. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the digital voice recorder, and pressed play. The room fell into a suffocating silence as Victoria's own high-pitched, mocking voice filled the kitchen, detailing her plans to alter clinic records and swap Eleanor's heart medication for heavy sedatives to make her appear mentally incompetent. Julian's face drained of color instantly, his mouth opening but no sound coming out as his voice echoed back from the speaker, confirming the financial fraud. Before they could speak, I opened my briefcase and placed Eleanor's leather medical diary on the table, followed by the private forensic toxicology report and the bank statements showing Julian's forged signatures on massive financial transfers. I told them that a retired precision machinist knows exactly how to trace a fault in a system, and that they had left a microscopic trail of greed that was now fully documented. Marcus's eyes darted from the papers to the voice recorder, his professional composure instantly shattering as he realized the sheer legal catastrophe unfolding before him. He knew that this was not a simple family dispute. It was a criminal conspiracy, and my close friend, a former federal prosecutor, already had copies of every single document. Marcus did not even try to defend them. He stood up so fast, his chair scraped violently against the floor, grabbed his briefcase, and fled the house without looking back, leaving the front door swinging open in his panic. Julian and Victoria were left utterly alone, pale, trapped, and completely exposed in their monstrous greed. I looked at my son, seeing the pathetic coward he had become, and told him that his mother's watch had stopped. But the countdown to their reckoning had finally begun. The sound of steel clicking shut is a noise I have heard 1,000 times in my machine shop. But hearing those heavy handcuffs snap around my own son's wrists shattered something deep within my soul. I stood in the hallway, watching in silence as the investigators led Julian and Victoria away. Their faces were pale, stripped of the arrogant defiance they had carried for months. Victoria tried to scream, her voice cracking with desperate lies, but the weight of the forensic toxicology report, the forged signatures, and the altered medical records left no room for denial. Julian looked back at me just once before they pushed him into the patrol car, his eyes filled with a pathetic, childlike fear. I stood on the porch of the house I built, feeling the immense, crushing weight of a father's grief, knowing that justice had finally arrived, even if it carved a permanent scar into my own family tree. They had tried to lock me away to fund their facade of luxury, completely underestimating the sharp, calculating mind of a retired precision machinist. An hour later, I sat on the weathered stone bench beside Eleanor's grave, the quiet cemetery offering a stillness my home had lacked for so long. I ran my rough, calloused fingers over the engraved letters of her name, feeling a profound, aching peace. I whispered to the quiet earth that the wolves had been driven away, that her voice had been heard through the tiny parchment she had so bravely hidden, and that the truth had finally prevailed. I apologized for not seeing her pain sooner, for letting my own blind trust obscure the malice of those we brought into this world. But looking at the ancient oak trees, I realized she was not truly gone. Her courage had saved me, and my precision had saved her legacy. The cold rage that had fueled my investigation for weeks finally evaporated, leaving behind only a pure, unconditional love that transcended the grave. When I returned home, the silence was no longer heavy. It was clean, like a workshop after a long, successful restoration. I sat down at our handmade oak kitchen table and reached into my cardigan pocket, pulling out Eleanor's vintage Swiss watch. Thomas had done a magnificent job, cleaning every microscopic gear and restoring the delicate balance wheel to its absolute perfection. I held the cold stainless steel casing in my palm, feeling its beautiful, solid weight. Gently, with the practiced precision of a man who had spent his life working with tight tolerances, I pinched the small crown between my thumb and forefinger and began to wind it. Each turn of the crown was a smooth, satisfying click, a quiet transfer of life back into the heart of the timepiece. Then I let go. The watch began to tick. It was a clear, rhythmic sound that immediately filled the quiet kitchen, a steady, unwavering heartbeat that echoed through the empty walls. In that perfect mechanical cadence, I did not just hear a clock working, I heard Eleanor. I heard the laughter of our youth, the quiet conversations over morning coffee, and the absolute certainty of the life we had built together. Julian and Victoria had traded their souls for a gilded cage, believing wealth could buy them a future, but they had forgotten that time is the only currency that truly matters. True love does not rust, and a legacy built on honesty cannot be stolen. I vow to use my remaining years to protect what we created, knowing Eleanor's heart still beats in the steady, flawless movement of the gears.